Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Good afternoon to all of you, or good morning, whatever the case may be. Today is our concluding session of the series of 5 conversations about the world in transition. And as we suggested last time, the topic for today would be Iran and the world in transition. Instead of reviewing our discussions during the first 4 sessions, I'm going to just go to the conclusion of those discussions. And we concluded last time that we have now reached the end of hegemony because of power shifts from Atlantic to Pacific, from traditional powers to emerging powers, from West to post-West, and the emergence of multi-centers of powers, that is, many contenders for positions of power in the world. We also noted as one of the components contributing to the end of hegemony the fact that we have non-state actors, basically ending the monopoly of states over economy, over information, over culture, and even over organized violence, that is war. Another reason for end of hegemony, in addition to power becoming decentralized and diversified globally, is that hegemonic actions, hegemonic tendencies have not produced the expected results. In fact, in most cases, they have produced exactly the opposite of the intended results. And in a world with many players, exercising hegemony has become more and more costly, economically costly, politically costly, because of the fact that the population, the populace in countries exercising hegemony do not see any benefits from those hegemonic tendencies, and the populations in the receiving end also show resentment and resistance to the exercise of hegemony. It's become impossible to exercise hegemonic tendencies at the global level. And it is clear that attempts to exercise hegemony are now fading, although some, particularly in the United States, still have hegemonic aspirations. As the saying goes, old habits die hard. We also discussed that in the transitional period, because of the fluidity, because of the turbulence, and because of severe competition, miscalculations are very costly. And when these miscalculations occur with regard to hegemonic tendencies, be it global or regional, they have disastrous consequences, both in terms of those who exercise it as well as those who are at the receiving end. Our region in West Asia has been the recipient of most of the attempts to either revolutionize or reactionary attempts during the transitional phase, and that is why we have suffered the most. The exercises in global and regional hegemony in our region have been extremely costly for both the United States, the regional powers who tried to exercise hegemony, as well as the people of the region. Another conclusion of our discussion up till the fourth session was the globalization of many of common goods, from environment to economy to emotions, and finally to security. Globalization of security, as you remember, meant that we cannot have zero-sum games. We cannot have losers and winners in any given situation, even in wars, which are the ultimate zero-sum situations. We do not have winners and losers. We have losers, some losing less, some losing more. That is why zero-sum games end up in negative sum. But we also notice the fact that nobody is going to stop playing zero-sum games out of altruism, out of idealism, because others are not playing, are continuing to play zero-sum games and intensely persisting on it. And that is why we have a perpetual system of negative sum outcomes. And we also have resistance to non-zero sum games. We discussed a couple of examples, Dialogue Among Civilizations, the Iran nuclear deal, and we saw how non-zero sum games have their enemies. Enemies who see their interests, their vested interests, basically at risk through non-zero sum outcomes. Now, the old paradigm of international relations, the paradigm that rests on exclusion, rivalry, zero-sum approaches, has been more persistent in the Persian Gulf region than anywhere else. The display of global rivalries in order to either institutionalize a new global order, try to reverse the global order, or create a different image at the global level using this transitional period, have all happened, or most happened, in this area. We all remember the beginning of the attempts to have a new position in the transitional period occurred in our areas. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait. As we discussed, it was tactically perfect. It even basically calculated the day on which the aggression started, a day that was the beginning of holidays in Europe and the beginning of the morning of Ashura in the region. So it was very well calculated tactically, but strategically it was flawed because it tried to gain a hegemonic presence in the region. Any of you who may have read the letter and the message from Saddam Hussein to the late President Rafsanjani of Iran may remember that his intention was not simply to gain control over Kuwait, but to gain control over the entire Persian Gulf. That is why he said in those messages that we are going, after invading Kuwait, that we are going to have 800 kilometers of border, of sea border with Iran, which is far beyond the borders of Kuwait. That would include Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and at least the United Arab Emirates. So his intention was clearly to establish a hegemonic presence in this region and probably in the wider Middle East. The next mistake in the region was made by the United States in trying to basically continue the process of liberation of Kuwait and to impose what they called a new world order, if you remember the former President Bush. Again, happened in our region. The next mistake, miscalculation, again by the United States, happened in our region in the invasion of Afghanistan. Now, after 19 years, they are negotiating how to get out of Afghanistan and basically negotiating with the same people they tried to evacuate. The next mistake also took place by the United States, again in this region, occupying Iraq and removing its government, which was they encountered the process of state building, nation building, which is an impossible task of hegemonic powers. So this region has been dominated basically by attempts to take advantage of the post-Cold War transitional period in order to reach new heights of power, either at the local level by Saddam Hussein or at the global level by the United States trying to institutionalize their basically temporary global ascendance. So the region has been a hotbed of the old paradigm. And that is why this region, the Persian Gulf region, I'm modest in explaining Iran's foreign policy, focusing on the Persian Gulf rather than the wider West Asia. Now, if we want to see what we can do in this region that has been the most troubled region in this transitional period, has seen wars, continues to see instability, always a hotbed of tension, extremism, terrorism, violations of all sorts of international norms, state boundaries. I forgot to mention one of the miscalculations in this post-Cold War transitional period was the attempt by Saudi Arabia, UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt to basically destroy Qatar, to suffocate Qatar by closing their airspace, their borders with Qatar, and putting all those restrictions and impositions on Qatar in order, again, to achieve a new balance. Now, let's not talk about Yemen, where another miscalculation took place, costing huge human suffering, probably one of the worst cases of cholera in recent history is happening in Yemen because of this miscalculation, a huge economic cost for Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates, certainly huge legitimacy costs for both of them, and they are not more secure today. Syria is the same, another attempt to use this period in order to push new rivalries and new hegemonic aspirations. In order to address this region that has been, basically this is our region and Iran's priority, and if we want to address the problem in this region which has been so threatened by these hegemonic tendencies during the post-Cold War, the first clear problem is the dominance of the old paradigm. This region, probably more than any other region, exemplifies, crystallizes the old paradigm. Exclusion, rivalries. I will explain them a bit later in greater detail. This region is faced with both old challenges as well as new challenges. All challenges in this region are basically old rivalries. Almost every country in southern Persian Gulf has territorial disputes with one or more of its neighbors. Tribal disputes, tribal rivalries, difficulties between rulers behind the public facade of handshakes and hugs, there are a lot of rivalries between every individual country in southern Persian Gulf, those who are members of the so-called GCC. Now we see that out in the open after the situation in Qatar, but that existed even before that. Then we have historical rivalries of Arabs versus non-Arabs. It's not Arabs versus Persians. It's Arabs versus non-Arabs. And today we see that clearly in the confrontation with some of the traditional Arab countries against Turkey. That confrontation, it's beyond competition now. That confrontation is probably more intense behind the scenes than the confrontation between some of these countries and Iran. We know that some of these countries were behind the coup in Turkey, and we know that some of these countries are pushing in order to create even further gap between Turkey and the Arab world. So it's the Arab non-Arab confrontation rather than the Arab-Persian confrontation, which is which some try to portray. Then we have the so-called sectarian divisions in this region, which are old, but were never cause for wars and conflicts, except when they were misused politically in order to advance expansionist causes. And as I said, we had territorial disputes. There are territorial disputes between countries in southern Persian Gulf. So the number one problem is the problem of old rivalries. This is not a new challenge. Existed all along. Did not lead to war, did not lead to confrontation, because we were not going through a transitional period. During a transitional period, competitions, rivalries become more intense, and that is why we see more intense confrontations between these countries since Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in order to expand his influence, believing that now the time was ripe for a new hegemonic presence. Saudi Arabia made the same mistake, trying to create a hegemonic presence in the Arab world. Now the United Arab Emirates is making the same mistake in Yemen, in Libya, elsewhere. The second major challenge in this region, which is giving rise to a lot of problems because countries in the region are looking at it from the old paradigm perspective, are asymmetries. There are huge asymmetries in this region. Asymmetries of geography. There are countries with enough access to international waters, and there are countries who feel suffocated. One example is Iraq. Iraq invaded Iran and then invaded Kuwait because it felt that it needed more access to international waters. So asymmetries in geography are a problem in this region, which are not new. Asymmetries in population. There are countries with huge population, with huge human resources like Iran, and there are countries with populations of less than 1 million. There are countries in which the original inhabitants, the indigenous population, is a minority. Almost every country in southern Persian Gulf, be it United Arab Emirates or Qatar, they have more expatriates than their own population. So there are asymmetries in terms of population. There are asymmetries in terms of natural resources. Countries in this region with very wealthy amount of natural resources in different areas, like Iran again, and there are countries in this region which suffer from lack of natural resources. Even within the United Arab Emirates, there are emirates which have huge natural resources and emirates that are rather less bestowed with natural resources, well, less endowed with natural resources. Wealth is another growing asymmetry, particularly because many of the countries in our region see stature in terms of wealth. And that is why when they do not see a comparable stature in comparison with their wealth, that makes them restive, uneasy. And that has been the case in the behavior of many of the wealthier countries in the southern Persian Gulf. And because of all these different asymmetries, there are asymmetries in power. There are countries, like Iran again, who rely on their own population as the source of power, who have natural resources, who have geographical abundance, who have human resource abundance. And then there are countries who primarily rely on the outside world for legitimacy, draw their legitimacy from the outside, use their wealth to buy security rather than to produce security, and therefore these asymmetries in overall power create tension in this region and create a misplaced need for protection. Protection from outside. Then a more recent phenomenon in our region is basically the perils of oil. Oil has certainly not been a blessing for this region. It has brought global rivalries to this region. It has created incomplete nation states. The process of nation building in many of the countries in the region has in fact been stillborn, never completed to create reliable, genuine feelings of nationhood, of nation state. Of course, the rentier state is another phenomenon precluding genuine sustainable development in our region. And that it won't be breaking a secret to say that our region has democracy deficit. Participation in our region is probably below average of other regions, any region you can name. Participation in this region, in the process of self-determination. Don't want to use the word democracy because there can be various forms of participation. Participation in determining the destiny of people in this region has been basically minimal, with the exception of Iran and more recently Iraq. Very little participation by the people in determining their future. And all of this has led to a sort of a mini paradigm for this region. You combine the fact that there are countries in this region who are hugely wealthy, probably some of the biggest sovereign funds in the world belong to the countries in this region, in terms of $1 trillion of sovereign funds. For the UAE, $1.1 trillion. For Saudi Arabia, before Yemen, something close to $1 trillion of sovereign funds basically invested in the West. So they have a lot of money. And the fact that there is an asymmetry of power always creates anxiety within these countries. So a lot of money, anxiety about their security. A lot of money, no genuine domestic legitimacy, no genuine hope that their own population will ever defend them. What would happen as a consequence? A doctrine of purchasing security. Our neighbors in the Persian Gulf believe that they can purchase everything. They can purchase the services of people from Southeast Asia, from South Asia. They can employ soldiers from countries in South Asia, countries in Africa, and they can buy loyalty and security from anybody who's prepared to offer it. The first person making that offer was who? Saddam Hussein. He offered to the countries in the region, primarily Saudi Arabia and Kuwait, that I will be your basically front line against Iran. Always in this purchase of security, you need an enemy, so that you can somebody can sell you security against that enemy. And people are very happy to portray somebody as the enemy because it is beneficial. Based on Saudi Arabia's own assertions, Saudi Arabia paid $75 billion to Saddam Hussein to support his war machine against Iran. Kuwait provided its ports, its oil, and its generous financial and political support to Saddam Hussein, because all of them wanted to purchase security from somebody who was prepared to provide it to them. Now we all see the consequence of that episode of purchasing security. The same guns, the same tanks, the same missiles that were bought by Saudi money and Kuwaiti money were targeted against Saudi Arabia and Kuwait by Saddam Hussein. That's the fundamental flaw in the concept of purchasing security. Then they went to the United States. Of course, they always relied on the United States for purchasing security, or United Kingdom. But then after US Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, they went full force to the United States, asking the United States to come and help, to again provide them security. And the United States charged them handsomely. While whatever the United States charged them is less than the cost it had on the United States. Because if you just look at the expenses that the United States has incurred over the past 30 years, from 1991, Iraqi invasion of Kuwait till now, no amount of military purchase would equal the amount of loss that the United States has suffered. So if President Trump or anybody else sitting in the White House is a calculating man, they can just use a spreadsheet and see that the adventure has not produced any economic benefit. So the US was second, provided this so-called security, but received quite a huge sum of money. And at the end of the day, it hasn't been able to protect these countries. Look at Yemen, look at Syria, look at elsewhere. The United States is just here to take advantage, not to provide security, while these countries may feel that they have been able to purchase security. Now they are going to Israel. It's the same concept. UAE is going to Israel in order to purchase security. But it doesn't know that Israel cannot even protect itself against some non-state actors, let alone provide them protection. They will take advantage of them for their own strategic benefit, but they will not be able to provide security. The fundamental flaw in the concept of purchasing security is that the belief that by money you can purchase loyalty. Whereas you provide money and the other side is prepared to milk you to the end of the road. But it doesn't mean that they are prepared to give you the security that you need. So we've seen the consequences. We've seen the Iraqi invasion of Iran, basically proxy war by Saddam on behalf of all of these countries against Iran. Then we've seen the war against Kuwait, Iraqi war against Kuwait. Then we've seen the war against Iraq. Then we've seen the war against Syria, the war against Yemen, the war against Qatar. Basically, it's a war. It's an economic war against Qatar. So we've had in this region, during this transitional period, and for the Iran-Iraq war leading to this transitional period, perpetual war, perpetual hostility, occupation, leading to resentment, leading to resistance, leading to violence, and most importantly, leading to non-state violence in the form of extremist organizations. So this has been the plight of our region in the past 30, 40 years. Trying to purchase security from anybody who was prepared to offer. Is there a way out? Or are we stuck in this? Is this going to be the ultimate destiny of this region, to remain in a perpetual state of war, hostility, lack of democratic development? I believe that the first has to be a cognitive transformation. We need to change our minds. As the preamble to UNESCO says, war starts in the minds of men, therefore we have to change the minds of men in order to change the state of war. We need a cognitive transformation in this region. We need to understand that zero-sum games have ended. Not ended in practice, but ended to be of utility. That zero-sum games will not produce winners, will produce only losers. The extent of loss will be different. That the process of exclusion will not bring about security. Process of creating enemies and excluding those enemies from your conceptualized version of security will never create security for you. Hegemony is no longer possible. Not that it's not desirable, it's not possible. As I said, hegemony is costly, economically, politically, diplomatically. If hegemony is not possible for the biggest military power in the world, that is the United States, it won't be possible for regional powers. So we need to recognize that hegemony is not possible. Countries in this region need to recognize that. And we all need to recognize that security cannot be purchased. Security needs to be homegrown, needs to be locally produced. We need to accept the failure of the old paradigm, cognitively. Because a lot of us talk about the need for cooperation, but we don't believe it. We still believe in the utility of the old paradigm. We still believe that by creating enemies, by creating exclusion, by creating alliances, we can in fact overcome our problems. If we make these cognitive changes, we need to move to the next stage. And that is a clear, intentional endeavor to create a strong region rather than competing strong men in the region. The picture that we now have in our region are strong men competing with each other. That picture is the old paradigm. We need to move from strong men competing in the region to a strong region. A strong region, which I will explain a bit later, which would mean inclusion of all, respect for the interest of all stakeholders, and indivisibility of security. That is, if you want security, your neighbor has to be secure. You cannot be secure if your neighbor is insecure. Can Iran be secure when Afghanistan is insecure? Impossible. Can Iran be secure when Pakistan is insecure? Impossible. Security is indivisible, particularly among neighbors. We need to recognize that we can compete with each other, but we cannot dominate or exclude one another. We are neighbors. We are here to stay. You do not have a choice over geography. You cannot exclude anybody from this region. Perhaps we could exclude outsiders, but we cannot exclude countries in this region. Iran can never exclude Saudi Arabia from this region. It is important for Iran to realize that, and I believe Iran knows this fact. But unfortunately, Saudi Arabia continues to believe that it can exclude Iran. Saudi Arabia believes that Arab world is none of Iran's business. I heard that myself. Arab world is none of your business. How can they say that? Iran is in this region. You cannot divide our neighborhood into Arab and non-Arab. Our neighbors are Arabs, and their insecurity affects our security. It is as if we tell Saudi Arabia that non-Arab world is none of your business. It doesn't work this way in a globalized world. We're all neighbors. We need to understand that we can compete with one another, but we cannot dominate or exclude one another. We need to understand that other regions have tried this and made life better for themselves. We need to understand that this region is spending the highest amount of money on arms. In 2017, GCC countries spent $116 billion on arms. Today, Secretary Pompeo in Israel announced US intention to sell more arms to this region, even in violation of US laws, in providing lethal drones. But they are going to do that because it always benefits them, at least temporarily, to sell more arms to this region. The military expenditure in this area in relation to GDP is highest in the world, even higher than the United States. Of course, Saudi Arabia is the third biggest military spender in the world after US and China, even going above Russia. But in terms of GDP, comparison to GDP, this region spends the highest amount on military. So the first need that we have in this region is to look for strong region rather than a strong man or competing strong men in the region. I have to finish this, so I'll take a bit longer today. The second concept that we need, and I'll be explaining these two concepts a bit more, is that we should understand that previous security coalitions, security alliances have not brought security to this region. In every security alliance or security coalition, those asymmetries are dominant. GCC, Saudi Arabia, if they want to work with NATO or Arab NATO, still they have bigger influences and smaller influences, so it does not resolve their problem. Alliances and coalitions have never worked in this region. We need to devise new concepts. For this region, we can devise a concept of security networking. Like a network, you have small nodes in a network, you have larger nodes in a network, but they all benefit from the advantages and suffer from the disadvantages in that network. But small and bigger nodes can in fact work within a network. If computers can do it, nations of this region can do it. So, move away from security alliances, which always have these permanent anxieties about size, about population, about power. Bloc formations, which have never produced security, be it the bloc with Saddam Hussein, or the bloc with the US against Saddam Hussein, or the bloc with Israel against Iran, none of them have produced or will produce security. And reliance on foreign powers for security, purchasing security, never reach the intended outcome. Security networking does not necessarily mean putting aside your differences. Alliances and coalitions basically need to work for, or at least against somebody. Security networking is not against anybody, does not require you to set aside your differences. You can work together, but you can have your differences and you can try to settle those differences through dialogue. But you can still be able to benefit from this common good, which is, as I said, indivisible. If you understand that security is indivisible in this region, then you can understand that you will best benefit from the security in terms of a network. Now, I'll read a few characteristics in order to save time of a security networking in a strong region. So we combine the two concepts. That is, instead of coalitions and alliances against each other, we build a network with each other. And instead of moving from a situation of strong men having rivalries to a situation that we have a strong region. What would be the characteristics of these concepts if we apply them to our region? First characteristic would be homegrown political and territorial stability. That everybody would accept territorial and political stability of all countries in the region, but not based on dependence, but based on regional cooperation. Reliance on the populace as the source of legitimacy security, and prosperity. Then another important step and characteristic of this regional networking and strong region is harmonization of national identities and regional citizenship. We all need to understand this is an important cognitive jump, that in this region we are in the same boat. We either sink together or sail together. That is an important realization. So we need to harmonize. We don't need to abandon our national identities. That is impossible. But we need to harmonize our national identities with the fact that we belong to this region. Participation of all regional countries in ensuring peace in the region through regional institutions, organizations, and ad hoc arrangements. You see, what I'm saying may sound very idealistic, but this happened in Europe after the Second World War. They tore each other up. But they could do this. So if anybody believes that this is outlandish, idealistic, no, it's not. It is idealistic to expect to have security when your neighbors are insecure, not to be secure with your neighbors. What I'm reading to you is basically a replica of both what happened in Europe after World War II and what happened in Europe in the Helsinki process. So if it worked there, why can't it work here? I had to interject this because I know some people believe these are idealistic, these will never happen in this region, you're wasting your time. No, we're not wasting our time. We're wasting our time if we continue with this paradigm. We're wasting not only our time, but our money, our blood, if we continue with this paradigm. So participation of all relevant regional countries in resolution of conflict through regional organizations, ad hoc arrangements, and institutions. More confidence, a strong region means more confidence, more trade, and more interaction between and among countries in the region than between any of them and the outside world. This would make a strong region. If our relations are stronger with the outside, that are only here to benefit and take advantage of us, than from ourselves who are here to stay with each other, then we don't have a strong region. Again, all of this is happening in Europe. Economic relations and people-centered interaction, making any resort to force and war costly and untenable. A regional culture that will place national security on par with regional security. And of course, a sustainable regional environment. These would be a characteristics of a strong region. Now, is there a roadmap to reach such a strong region? I am here replicating exactly the Helsinki process. So please, don't take this as something out in the wild. This is something that has happened under the worst circumstances in 1970s, when Europe was going through the possibility of a nuclear war at any time. The first is entrance ticket. In order to be a member of this region, strong region, and this regional networking, security networking, you need to buy a ticket. Nobody can be excluded because they don't speak Arabic or Farsi or English or whatever. No, you only need to buy a ticket. This ticket is acceptance of a certain principles. In the CSCE, which is now OSCE, they called it ticket basket. These principles can include something that we can all accept, but maybe a bit more difficult to implement. Preservation of territorial integrity and stabilities of the countries in the region through the strengthening of domestic governance and prevention of external aggression. Not too difficult. Promotion of good governance throughout the region. Exercise of self-restraint by all regional powers, not to jump to attacking each other. Non-proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Promotion of a regional balance and rejection of hegemony by regional and extra-regional powers. That is, no coalition with an extra-regional state against regional states. No rejection of hegemony means that you don't bring an outsider in order to balance regional states. Strengthening of regional economic prowess. Adherence to UN Charter and multilateralism. This would be the first basket. The second basket is dialogue. You need to be prepared for dialogue in this region. We're not conducting dialogue. We are talking about each other, not to each other. Everybody is talking about this region, but to foreigners. People in this region are not talking to each other about this region. That has to start. And that should be a dialogue. Dialogue, as we discussed in the previous meetings, is based on equal footing, is based on being ready to listen and to be convinced more than wanting to convince others. That's when dialogue takes place. Dialogue doesn't take place when you only want to convince the other side. Dialogue takes place only when you are prepared to listen and are ready to be convinced. And confidence building. The third basket, and again, copying from the CSCE, is CBM. CBMs are wide and varied. It can start from just tourism. Nuclear safety, not security. Nuclear safety in the Persian Gulf area. Water management in the Persian Gulf area. You know that because of desalination in the Persian Gulf, the water is becoming heavy. And most of our neighbors in southern Persian Gulf depend on the waters in the Persian Gulf in order to be able to drink. And desalination is making this water heavier and heavier. So we have common interests, which are not controversial, to use functionalist terminology, which can attract cooperation. But we have to address the flaw of functionalism, and that is the existence of a political will to cooperate. That should precede the functional cooperation. We need to have a political desire to cooperate, to build confidence in these areas. We can have people-to-people contact, tourism, economic cooperation, joint ventures, etc., etc. Natural disasters, youth employment, women empowerment, all of these areas where this region requires more work, we can put our energies and our experience together. This is possible for this region, provided that the idea of purchasing security from outside is abandoned. Provided that the need for an enemy in the region, hoping that the United States will come and cut the snake's head. You remember? There was this idea by the late King Abdullah, according to WikiLeaks, come and cut the head of the snake. Well, as long as they can milk you, they'll never cut the head. Because then how can they milk you? We need to change that approach. How would the biggest enemy of the Arab world be able to have relations with the United Arab Emirates if they did not have this snake? They create this in order to be able to milk you. If you want a strong region, you need to not allow them to make this situation in order to be able to take advantage of the countries in the region. Now, Iran, for its part, understanding the importance of this transitional period, understanding the fact that in the previous transitional periods, countries like Iran have all lost because we either did not have the knowledge, the recognition of the realities, or the courage to exercise what was needed at the time. But now, hopefully, it's different. We both understand and we both have the courage to move forward. And that is why Iran has exercised self-restraint in this region in the face of a lot of provocations. And Iran has put forward formally, within the past 7 years, but even during the Iran-Iraq war, ideas for cooperation in the region. The first time those ideas were presented were in 1986, at the height of the Iran-Iraq war, when the then foreign minister of Iran wrote a letter to the Secretary General asking him to make arrangements for regional security. Those arrangements are reflected in paragraph 8 of Security Council Resolution 598, which calls on the Secretary General to create a regional security mechanism. So this is a fundamental belief of Iran. It doesn't mean that a reformist government or a conservative government or whatever classifications or categorizations Westerners like to use about Iran. In the past 7 years, Iran has proposed a regional dialogue forum, a regional non-aggression pact. A non-aggression pact can be the beginning of a regional dialogue forum or the end of a regional dialogue forum. That is, a regional dialogue forum can start from the non-aggression pact and then go into the mechanisms of a regional dialogue based on what I said about security networking and a strong region, or can start working on those areas and lead to a non-aggression pact. And finally, in the last meeting of the UN General Assembly, Iran's president proposed the Hormuz peace endeavor. The beauty of the Hormuz peace endeavor is that we found a word that is common among all countries in the region. Unfortunately, countries in the region have even learned how to fight over names, historical names. Can only happen in this region. But it comes from outside. But Hormuz, thankfully, is a common name. And the Hormuz community is basically Persian Gulf littoral states. The Hormuz Peace Initiative, endeavor or hope, is based on the same approach, same principles, same idea of a strong region. So if I'm talking about these possibilities for the future, Iran is exercising what it preaches. And we believe that the transitional period requires a new approach, requires a new paradigm. Otherwise, this transitional period will be disastrous for everybody. Thank you very much.